Hello everyone, and here's tiny little old me. It's great to be with you this evening for my first storytelling. I'm trying to imagine you all naked, it's not helping. All right, here we go. I'd never dressed a dead body before, until last year. It was early August, a balmy Cairns afternoon, and I'm at the funeral home called the Birkin and Svensson on Mulgrave Street. I'm there because my Uncle Michael had passed away the week before, aged 68, following a very long battle with renal failure. Growing up in our family, my mother always referred to us kids as the licorice all sorts. That's because I'm an Australian of mixed-race heritage, like many of you in the audience. But I have Irish, English, Filipino, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ancestry. So for those who aren't aware, it's common in Torres Strait culture that the family gather the day before the funeral to dress our dead. This is a gendered responsibility, so the men in the family dress the deceased male relative, and the women gather to dress deceased female relatives. It's also common then for family to cut locks of hair off their dead relative to preserve as a keepsake for the future. So I didn't quite know what to think or how to react when my uncle's long-term companion, Arnie Carroll, invited me and my younger brother Matthew to do the honours. We didn't grow up with culture, and this is something that I wasn't used to. My uncle didn't have any kids, so the obligation fell to us. I consulted family at first, not knowing how to respond. Although I'd seen dead bodies before in my time in Africa and having survived a near-fatal car crash on the Ivory Coast, this was very different. It was a close relative. They tried to dissuade me, and I mulled on their words. But in the end, I was resolved that this is something that I really wanted to do, both for my uncle and for my family. So in the days after my uncle's death, our family gathered to pack up his small unit in downtown Cairns, and I began turning my mind to an outfit that I could select. I rummaged through the drawers and I found a pair of olive chinos. I then paired this with his favourite cream jacket. And then I looked through his shirts and I found this most magnificent ochred, sort of burnt orange coloured dress shirt that would look magnificent with those items. I grabbed an R.M. Williams belt, a deep tanned one with a silver buckle, and put that into the dry cleaning bag. But the centrepiece, or the pièce de résistance for the outfit, was this tiny Aboriginal flag lapel pin that had the words "always was, always will be" embossed around the rims. So here I am back at the funeral home with the items in a dry cleaning bag. My father's gone into the reception with Arnie Carroll to fill out the final pieces of paperwork, and my brother's standing next to me. Moments later, the funeral director comes and he introduces himself and he says, "Do you have any questions or anything you'd like to know before we go and see the body?" I reached into the bag and handed him a rolled up bottle green pair of boxer shorts that belonged to my uncle. You see, I'd never seen my uncle naked in life, and it was important for me to preserve his dignity in death. The funeral director disappeared for a few moments, and then he returned. It was time to go in, so we walked into the main chapel where the funeral would be held the following day. It's a fairly bland sort of environment with just these little rows of chairs, beige, sort of cream colours, nothing amazing. But in the far corner at the very sort of centre of the room, I could see the coffin where my uncle was lying in waiting. So me, my brother Matthew, the funeral director, proceed by the coffin right near my uncle's body. The first thing the funeral director said is that we can't touch your uncle's body with your bare hands for hygiene reasons, and I understood that. So he'd given us this sort of box of latex gloves. Got off to an awkward start with my giant hands piercing through the gloves. It was really awkward. Second pair, third pair, and I think maybe on the sixth pair I was sort of locked in, too frightened to move. But for a moment I was really scared for my brother, thinking he'd have to do the dressing by himself. The funeral director said that we would start with the first half or the upper half of my uncle's body. So we would do the shirt and the jacket. So we flanked either side, the funeral director on the left, me on the right, and my brother next to him. We reached under my uncle's back and gently lifted him up. I was quite surprised at the ease and the flexibility that was shown in that movement, because I'd always believed that bodies would be quite stiff and rigid, but it wasn't, thankfully. So as we began to dress my uncle in his shirt and delicately put his hands through the sleeve, I began to reflect on his life. My Uncle Michael was a very angry person, one of the most tormented souls that you'd ever know. That's because when he was 7, he was removed from my grandmother, his mother, along with his 4 other siblings, in October 1958 and declared a ward of the state. He was a member of the stolen generation. He was ultimately exiled to Palm Island Aboriginal settlement off the coast of Queensland. Now, being separated from your family and removed from your mother would be enough to destroy any man, and it did Uncle Michael for many, many years. He turned to alcohol to cure his ills, and I remember as a kid when he lived with our family, the sort of anger and bearing the brunt of his moods, when he came home one day and he kicked our family pet with his steel boots and the steel cap boots connecting with our dog's ribs and the yelp that it made. I also remember the time when I was about 8 and I was home alone, as kids did in the 70s. And Uncle Michael came home a little earlier than expected in a drunken mood and chased me through the house, abusing me, threatening to kill me, forcing me to run into my mum and dad's room, lock the door and flee out the window. He was a really angry man. But then the next morning, he was a different person, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He'd be sitting at the table going to work as he did every other time, filling out a crossword as if nothing had happened. As we moved to the trousers, I began to think of some of the lighter and funnier moments in my uncle's life. Like the time he'd gone to the pub, spent all his money and couldn't afford a taxi home. So he did what any reasonable drunk person would do, went to the river, the Leichhardt River that runs through the city of Mount Isa. It was flooded, raging. He floated on his back 5 kilometres downstream all the way to our family home. For the life of me, I will never forget the sight of Uncle Michael walking through the door, his clothes shredded, looking like the Swamp Thing. A sight to behold. Then there was the other time he overdosed on my grandmother's tablets. He took them all in one hit. What he failed to realise is that they were my grandmother's coloxal drops, her constipation tablets, and he shit himself for many, many days. That's a great memory. Bit of revenge. Back at you, Uncle Michael. But my favourite memories of Uncle Michael was of a man who was my age when I'm 48 now, as was he, when he turned his life around, when he got diagnosed with renal failure. He put himself through university, did a Bachelor of Welfare degree at James Cook University, and then dedicated the rest of his years to helping Aboriginal prisoners at Lotus Glen Prison just outside of Cairns as a counsellor and as a welfare worker. It's quite amazing, really, to think of the sort of difficult life that he'd had and the sort of positive legacy that he'd left behind. But in his final days, I'm really glad that I took the road trip from Townsville down to Cairns to visit him in hospital. He'd been cooped up all week, and it was clear to my sister Nairi, my brother-in-law Dale and me, that he hadn't seen much sunshine. So we commandeered one of those dinky little wheelchairs that you see in the hospital and took him for a walk along the Cairns Esplanade. It was a really silent but beautiful moment. Not a lot needed to be said. It was just quality time. But it was in those final days that I actually saw who my uncle really was. He dropped his vulnerability. He told me he loved me for the first time in 47 years. He told me he was proud of me and that I looked well. Prior to that, he'd said really nothing positive. He was quite a grouchy, negative person. So our work was done. My brother grabbed a little pair of scissors and delicately cut the locks of hair off Uncle Michael's head, placed them into a clip seal bag, being very careful not to drop a strand. And my work was done when I delicately pinned that Aboriginal flag lapel that my Uncle Michael loved so much. And while some people might consider that dirty work, to me, it remains a tremendous honour and a privilege to have dressed my Uncle Michael that day. Thank you.